Tyler Kane was a man no one noticed, until the morning he turned an ordinary Minnesota mall into a scene of chaos and fear. Armed, masked, and vanishing without a trace, he became the ghost every officer in the state was hunting. This is the story of how investigators followed his hidden trails, uncovered his darkest secrets, and finally captured the Minnesota mass shooter before he could strike again. It began on an ordinary Saturday morning in Minnesota. The kind of morning where the skies were clear, the streets were calm, and people felt safe in the routines they had followed countless times before. Families filled breakfast diners with the smell of pancakes and coffee drifting through the air. Children clutched their parents' hands as they walked into the mall to shop for back-to-school clothes, and young couples lingered at the food court, making plans for the rest of the weekend. Nothing in those early hours hinted at the chaos that was about to unfold. At 10:23 a.m., everything changed. The sharp crack of gunfire ripped through the calm like a violent storm. At first, some thought it was a loud noise from construction or perhaps fireworks. But the second and third bursts of shots left no doubt. People screamed as bullets shattered glass storefronts and echoed across the mall's open spaces. The shoppers who had been casually browsing seconds before now scrambled to the ground, dropping bags, cell phones, and drinks in their panic. Some ran toward exits. Others pressed themselves into hidden corners, and many froze, unable to process the terror erupting around them. The calls to 911 started immediately, one after another, frantic voices all describing the same figure, a man dressed entirely in black, wearing a mask and carrying a rifle. He moved with terrifying purpose, not like someone acting on impulse, but like a figure who had rehearsed his every step. Witnesses reported he did not linger in one place, did not shout or speak, and did not hesitate. He fired in bursts, sending people scattering, then disappeared deeper into the maze of corridors. Within minutes, police were on their way, sirens growing louder as patrol cars raced through suburban streets toward the mall. Helicopters were scrambled, broadcasting images of terrified crowds streaming into the parking lot. The world outside was quickly gripped by panic as news outlets broke into live coverage, their anchors reading updates that changed by the minute. Parents texted their children, unsure if they were safe, and neighborhoods nearby were told to stay inside. By the time officers stormed the mall, the shooter was gone. Broken glass crunched under their boots as they fanned out, weapons raised, searching for any sign of the attacker. Shoppers sobbed as they were escorted out, some bleeding from cuts caused by shattered windows, others trembling and refusing to let go of strangers who had shielded them in the chaos. But the man in black had vanished. There were bullet casings, trails of overturned merchandise, and the lingering smell of gunpowder, but no suspect. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air. That absence, that unexplained disappearance, unsettled even the most experienced officers. This was not the pattern of a random outburst. It was the mark of someone who knew how to instill fear and then escape without a trace. Minnesota had just witnessed the start of something far more dangerous than a lone violent act. It was the beginning of a story that would grip the entire state in fear. Investigators worked tirelessly in the hours following the attack, their focus sharpened by the mystery of how a heavily armed gunman could vanish from a building swarming with frightened shoppers. The first step was to lock down every corner of the mall, combing through the scene for evidence while officers interviewed witnesses who were still shaking from the chaos. Bullet casings were carefully bagged, fragments of shattered glass swept up, and security footage collected from dozens of cameras mounted across the property. The images told a story, though not a complete one. The man appeared on screen multiple times, moving calmly between shops, never rushing, never faltering, as if he had memorized the layout. His confidence unsettled detectives. This was not a figure acting at random, but someone who had studied the terrain. The footage showed him raising his rifle, firing into the air, sending panicked crowds scattering, and then cutting across the food court. There, the trail abruptly ended. Cameras covering the exits revealed nothing. Officers stationed at every doorway confirmed they had seen no one matching his description leaving the building. For a moment, it seemed impossible. How could someone vanish from such a crowded space without being spotted? The answer came when a member of the security team recalled hearing an alarm near a service corridor that morning. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention during the chaos, but when detectives checked, they found a heavy steel maintenance door pried open. Dust and grime had been disturbed, showing fresh marks of movement. Beyond that door was something few had considered. A network of narrow tunnels that ran beneath the mall, constructed decades ago for utilities and maintenance crews, and long forgotten by most. As detectives descended into the dim passages, the air smelled of mildew and rust. Their flashlights swept across pipes, concrete walls, and decades of debris. It was the perfect place for someone to slip away unnoticed. Footprints marked the dust in certain areas, proving without doubt that the gunman had gone this way. The realization spread quickly through the investigative team. He hadn't escaped by luck. He had known exactly where to go. Knowledge of such hidden areas suggested more than chance. It suggested planning, familiarity, and an inside connection. The discovery shifted the direction of the case. What had seemed like a public shooting followed by a desperate flight was now unfolding as a calculated strike carried out by someone who understood the mall better than most. Investigators pored over employee records, seeking names of people who might have had access to these underground areas. Maintenance workers, custodians, and security staff were suddenly placed under scrutiny. Every lead, no matter how small, was chased. The attacker had left behind no shell casings in the tunnels, no weapon, and no clothing. He had vanished into the city beyond. But the tunnels told detectives something critical. He had prepared for this long before the first shot was fired. This was not a random act of rage. It was a plan years in the making, and now the man who carried it out was somewhere in Minnesota, free and possibly ready to strike again. The breakthrough in the investigation came when the list of past employees was compared with known criminal records. Among the names, one stood out more than the rest. Tyler Kane, a 34-year-old former janitor, had left the mall abruptly 6 months earlier. His departure was never explained to his supervisors, and his personnel file showed a string of warnings about erratic behavior, frequent absences, and angry confrontations with co-workers. What made Kane even more suspicious was the position he once held. As a maintenance worker, he had unrestricted access to service areas, storage rooms, and the tunnels that wound beneath the property. The very passages he seemed to vanish into during the attack had once been part of his daily routine. Detectives dug deeper into Kane's background, and the picture that emerged was unsettling. He had grown up in Minnesota, but never stayed in one place for long. Neighbors described him as withdrawn, a man who kept to himself, rarely spoke, and carried an air of bitterness wherever he went. Public records revealed he had been evicted multiple times for failing to pay rent, and police reports showed a history of disturbances, though none had led to serious charges. Online, he had left behind angry posts filled with resentment toward society, ranting about being ignored and cast aside. He seemed to blame the world for his failures, building a narrative where he was the victim and others deserved to pay the price. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators entered his last known apartment. The unit was nearly empty, stripped of furniture and personal belongings. Exposed wires hung from the walls where electronics had been torn out, and several charred piles of paper suggested he had destroyed evidence before leaving. What remained was more telling than what was gone. Small boxes of ammunition were found hidden in a closet, along with scraps of paper containing crude sketches of the mall's layout. He had circled entrances, stairwells, and hallways with precision, notes scribbled in the margins about times when crowds were heaviest. This was not the work of an impulsive man. It was the work of someone who had planned meticulously. Detectives realized they were not just chasing a shooter, but a strategist who had anticipated every move. He had chosen a place he knew intimately, prepared escape routes long in advance, and ensured he left nothing behind that would slow him down. His behavior pointed to someone who might strike again. What unsettled authorities most was the absence of any trace of where he had gone. No bank transactions, no phone activity, and no sightings had been reported since the day of the attack. It was as if he had stepped off the map completely. The case was evolving into something larger than a local investigation. The FBI was brought in, analysts pored over digital footprints, and agents studied his past for overlooked connections. Yet, the deeper they looked, the more Kane seemed like a phantom, a man who had erased himself before unleashing his violence. For investigators, one truth became clear. They were not dealing with someone who stumbled into crime. They were facing an individual who had transformed isolation and resentment into a deliberate plan, and now he was free, hiding somewhere in Minnesota, waiting for another opportunity to strike. The search for Tyler Kane grew into one of the largest manhunts Minnesota had ever seen. Local police joined forces with federal agents, forming a task force that worked around the clock. Roadblocks appeared on highways stretching out from the city. Helicopters hovered above rural farmland, and officers went door to door in small towns, showing Kane's photo to anyone who might have seen him. His image was broadcast on every news channel, his name repeated so often that it became synonymous with fear. Yet for all the resources poured into the search, he continued to slip through their grasp. Every tip seemed to end in disappointment, wrong sightings, mistaken identities, or abandoned buildings that held nothing but dust. It was as if Kane had rehearsed disappearing as carefully as he had rehearsed his attack. Still, pieces of his trail began to surface. Investigators noticed a pattern when reviewing purchases in nearby counties. In one small town, a man resembling Kane had bought canned food, water purification tablets, and camping gear. In another, a similar figure had picked up fuel containers and a heavy-duty tarp. These were not random purchases. They were the supplies of someone preparing to live off the grid. Agents tracked the transactions back to a hardware store clerk who described the man clearly: tall, gaunt, with piercing eyes that never met hers directly. She had felt something unsettling about him but hadn't realized until later who he was. This confirmation reignited the hunt. Following the lead, authorities focused their search on the thick forests of northern Minnesota, where miles of wilderness could easily conceal a fugitive. Teams combed through cabins, hunting shacks, and campsites, looking for any sign of habitation. It was in one of these remote cabins, half-collapsed and hidden under dense pines, that investigators made their most chilling discovery yet. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of rotting wood and smoke. On a crude wooden table lay notebooks filled with Kane's handwriting. The pages detailed disturbing fantasies of mass violence, lists of potential targets, and diagrams of public spaces across the state. He had circled stadiums, schools, and shopping centers, jotting down the busiest hours for each. It became clear he was not satisfied with one attack. He had envisioned many. The cabin itself suggested he had been there recently. A pan sat on the stove with the remnants of a meal. A bedroll lay unrolled in the corner, and muddy footprints led out the back door into the woods. Authorities knew they had come painfully close to capturing him, but once again he had slipped through their fingers. This near miss heightened the urgency of the search. The realization spread through the task force like a cold shock. Kane was still planning, still preparing, and every day he remained free was another chance for him to strike again. The manhunt intensified. Drones scanned tree canopies. Tactical teams swept abandoned rail yards, and plainclothes officers monitored bus stations and truck stops. Yet Kane remained a step ahead. Each clue uncovered painted him as someone who thrived on evasion, someone who enjoyed watching the chaos left in his wake. For the officers hunting him, frustration grew, but so did determination. They could not allow him to vanish into the wilderness forever. Somewhere out there, Tyler Kane was moving quietly, adjusting his plans and waiting for the perfect moment to unleash more violence. The only question was whether the task force would find him before he decided to strike again. Weeks passed, and the fear surrounding Tyler Cain only deepened. Entire neighborhoods lived on edge, locking doors earlier than usual and jumping at the sound of sirens in the distance. Every day that Cain remained free felt like a countdown to another tragedy. Law enforcement understood this too, and their search became more relentless. Analysts tracked every movement of goods, every unusual purchase of ammunition or fuel, and every report of a lone figure spotted near the edges of towns. For a time, these efforts yielded little, but then a breakthrough arrived in the form of surveillance footage from a freight yard outside Minneapolis. A drone scanning the area at night picked up a tall man slipping between the darkened rail cars, moving with the same quiet purpose seen in the mall footage. The grainy images were enough. Investigators were convinced they had finally found him. The freight yard was the perfect hiding place. Miles of tracks stretched outward, lined with stacked containers and idle trains that created a maze of steel and shadow. Workers came and went at all hours, making it easy for a stranger to blend in without drawing suspicion. Cain had chosen his refuge carefully, but the task force had grown wiser to his methods. Rather than rushing in, they set a trap with painstaking patience. Officers disguised themselves as yard workers, moving naturally among the trains during the day while keeping hidden watch at night. Motion sensors were placed discreetly along the tracks, each one capable of alerting the team if Cain tried to shift from one hiding spot to another. The exits of the yard were sealed quietly, roadblocks positioned far enough away to avoid drawing his attention. For the first time since the shooting, Cain was boxed in, though he did not know it. For 2 nights they observed him from a distance. Cain stayed hidden, sometimes climbing into an empty boxcar, sometimes slipping beneath the shadows of locomotives. He carried a rifle slung across his back, as though waiting for an opportunity to use it again. His movements suggested calculation, not panic. He was watching, waiting, perhaps planning to strike in another crowded place. The patience of the officers was tested, but the command was clear. Wait for the right moment, strike only when success was certain. On the 3rd night, the silence broke. A motion sensor blinked as Cain moved toward the edge of the yard. He carried a duffel bag this time, heavier than before, dragging slightly as he walked. Agents suspected it contained more weapons or supplies for his next escape. He moved with the same deliberate steps as always, unaware that he had triggered the net closing around him. From the darkness, laser sights dotted the ground near his feet, growing brighter as officers stepped from their hiding places. Cain froze, then tried to turn back, but every path was blocked. Officers emerged from all sides, rifles raised, voices commanding him down. For the first time, Cain appeared shaken. He dropped the bag, tightened his grip on his weapon, but hesitated. That hesitation was all the officers needed. They surged forward, overwhelming him with sheer force, tackling him before he could fire another shot. The arrest ended in silence, broken only by the echo of handcuffs snapping shut. Relief swept through the task force, through the city, through the entire state. The man who had terrified Minnesota was finally in custody, captured alive. Yet even in that moment of victory, investigators were haunted by the evidence recovered from his bag and the notebooks left in his cabin. There were maps of more public spaces, more targets circled, more dates underlined. The scope of his plans had been larger than anyone imagined. Authorities knew they had stopped him, but the chilling thought remained. If he had evaded capture just a little longer, another tragedy would have unfolded. Minnesota could finally breathe again, but the memory of his calculated violence would not fade quickly. Cain had been caught, but the shadows he left behind lingered, a reminder of how thin the line between safety and terror can be.